Welcome to the Nebraska Department of Education's Making It Stick Professional Development webinar series. I'm Dr. Michael Quinn, and I'll be your host for Module 1, Building a Core Instructional Model. Wondering how to increase academic learning time in your classroom? Great! The Core Instructional Model webinar will take 35 minutes. Throughout this module, we built in some learner engagement activities to ensure your comprehension. When you see the pencil icon, you'll be asked to pause, reflect, engage, and write in your viewing guide. Feel free to stop, start, and rewind as needed. After you complete the module, we'll ask you a few quick questions to see if we've helped you meet the lesson's objectives. Let's get started. Here's our umbrella question for today. How can a consistent, school-wide instructional model increase academic learning time? Because we always want to increase academic learning time, we'll explore the following strategies. First, we'll discuss how to create academic learning time in your classroom. Second, we will explore the components of the anatomy of a lesson. Third, we will study the gradual release of responsibility. Finally, we will help you transfer knowledge and think about how this applies to your own classroom or role as an educator. As we begin our webinar, let's take a look at the 3 big ideas from the book Cultures Built to Last by Dufour and Fullen. These authors challenge you to consider the following. How can your school build a relentless focus on learning, a collaborative culture and collective effort to support student and adult learning? And finally, do you have a result-focused orientation to improve practice and drive continuous improvement? As we work through our webinar series, you'll be able to articulate and provide example strategies of how your school collectively approaches each of these 3 big ideas. In order to address Dufour and Fullen's 3 big ideas, we need a common vocabulary. Take a look at these 4 words: competence, metacognition, explicit, systematic. Let's define our 4 terms. If you're viewing as a staff or PLC, feel free to pause the video to create common or shared definitions with your colleagues. Push play when you're ready to resume. Did your shared definitions address what you know for competence, thinking about thinking for metacognition, clear or present for explicit, ordered or linear for systematic? Let's connect competence, metacognition, explicit, and systematic to the 4 states of mind. In the 1970s, psychologist Noel Birch suggested a model for how we master skills, calling it the conscious competence learning model. These 4 states of mind describe the psychological traits that are involved in transforming skill and competence to mastery. Conscious competent is where we all need to be. We'll revisit conscious competent in a moment. Starting off in the lower left corner, we have low competence and low metacognition. Plainly put, you don't know what you don't know. In terms of instruction, these teachers are unaware of best practice and need a systematic approach to their instruction. Because of their low metacognition, they are unaware of a need to change their teaching methods. Let's now look at the bottom right-hand corner, conscious incompetent. Here we have the teachers who know they are lacking the necessary instructional tools and strategies. In terms of instruction, these teachers are aware of best practice and simply need a systematic approach to their instruction. They are low in competence, but high in metacognition. Jumping up to the top left, here we have the unconscious competent. High in competence, but low in metacognition. When lessons go well, they are unable to articulate why. These teachers may be going off their intuition, but can't put their finger on the explicit process that drives their success. And that brings us to our final state of mind, the goal for all educators, the conscious, competent. High metacognition and high competence. These teachers know the critical attributes and can repeat the behavior at will. They can explicitly describe the strategies they employ and understand why they are effective. More importantly, they can repeat the behavior. They have a systematic approach to instruction that is the product of careful planning and thoughtful choices based on data. Either by yourself or in a group, let's take some time to digest and reflect on the states of mind. Consider the following questions. How would each state of mind influence a school's culture of excellence? Which state would most positively influence a culture of excellence? For example, how do unconscious competent teachers affect a culture of excellence? Refer back to the 3 big ideas from earlier in this webinar. Your viewing guide contains a place for you to record your thoughts and questions. Please pause the video for a moment and write down your answers to the questions in your viewing guide. Press play when you're ready to resume. According to Marzano, we can see that after 2 years of exposure to ineffective teaching, an average student can drop to the 3rd percentile. This is unfortunate. However, if you take that same student and put them with a highly effective teacher, after 2 years, his or her performance can rise to the 96th percentile. Wow! So what is highly effective teaching? What are highly effective teachers doing in their classrooms? Imagine walking down a school hallway. We are often focused on what the teacher is doing. How can we tell if student learning is going on? What are some behavioral indicators of student learning? Think about what a highly effective classroom would look like and sound like. How do students and teachers effectively engage each other? High-achieving classrooms, much like the workplace, effectively use their time. This question is for independent reflection. Which time is most prevalent in your classroom? Allocated time is our schedule, how many minutes we allot to certain subjects or lessons. Engaged time is just that, when our students are actively engaging content. This can look different in many classrooms. However, being engaged isn't enough. We can be actively participating, but does that mean we are learning? When students leave the classroom, which new lessons will they take with them? In our classrooms, how do we move beyond engaged time to true academic learning time? When all the ingredients come together, we are making sure that we aren't just teaching, but that students are actually learning. We need to have just the right amount of allocated time. Our students have to be actively engaged with the content, and they have to successfully complete a task or demonstrate their knowledge. For example, in geometry, calculating the area of different shapes. When students authentically demonstrate knowledge, we have academic learning time. To help us move towards a consciously competent use of classroom time, let's break down the critical attributes of academic learning time. We can boil academic learning time down to 3 main components. Students know and understand the lesson objective. Students actively manipulate content in relation to the lesson objective. During this active manipulation, students are experiencing a 75 to 95% success rate. Academic learning time's attributes apply to all grade levels and content areas. You've spent some time thinking about what a highly effective classroom is in general, but let's get more specific. Either by yourself or in a group, think about your own grade level or content area. What does active manipulation of the content look like and sound like through your content area lens? If you're viewing as a staff or PLC, share your ideas with your group. Please pause the video for a moment and write down your answers to the questions in your viewing guide. Press play when you're ready to resume. Now that you know what needs to happen, let's take a look at a framework that ensures students are achieving academic learning time. This is the anatomy of a lesson, and it is from our Literacy First process. It gives teachers a framework in which to plan their lessons. Each of these acronyms represent a critical part of the lesson planning process. Let's break them down first regarding time. This graphic helps us to see the anatomy of a lesson in a linear, time-allocated display. Notice that we are monitoring and adjusting our instruction 100% of the time. Teachers must be present in the moment, collecting formative data and using it to make real-time adjustments as needed. First is ARK, activate, assess, and augment if necessary relevant knowledge, or knowledge that is needed to understand the lesson objective. Next is TIP, the teacher input. This can be the direct instruction portion of the lesson. Notice the proportion of our allocated time. Where we see a large portion of allocated time is SAP, student active participation. This is when our students are actively engaged with the content. We'll look into this portion in a bit more detail in a moment. And finally, ISS, identify student success. This is where we use our formative assessments to check for student understanding. Let's revisit our linear, time-allocated display. Remember, we are monitoring and adjusting 100% of the time. All through the lesson, we are monitoring and adjusting our instruction. This is a critical piece of academic learning. If we want to ensure a 75 to 95% success rate, we need to use formative assessments throughout the lesson. Let's take one more look at each lesson element one by one. First, we have ARK. Here, we ensure that students understand the lesson objective and we activate their relevant knowledge related to the objective at hand. We can also create an emotional hook between the student and the lesson objective to provide relevance and meaning. Here is the bulk of our lesson. Notice that students are doing all the heavy lifting. In our planning, we have to carefully create that 20% input to 45% participation balance. Our role becomes more of a coach rather than a player. Think guide on the side rather than a sage on the stage. If teachers are talking for more than 20% of the lesson, they are taking up valuable time for students to actively manipulate the content. During SAP, teachers can provide the necessary scaffolding to help all students reach the next phase. ISS, identify student success. As you can see, identifying student success requires students to reflect and explain their thought process, then show evidence of their learning. And now, let's reflect. Either by yourself or in a group, consider the question on the screen. How can this model help you move towards consciously competent? Look back to the diagram and our vocabulary word bank to help you craft your response. If you're viewing as a staff or PLC, discuss with your colleagues as well. Please pause the video for a moment and write down your answers to the questions in your viewing guide. Press play when you're ready to resume. To help us use the anatomy of a lesson effectively, let's consider the research of Pearson and Gallagher and their model, the Gradual Release of Responsibility. This gives us a framework to use as we craft the two largest components of the lesson, teacher input and student active participation. As you can see, we gradually release responsibility to students. Imagine a young boy learning to ride a bike. For modeled, the child watches his mom or dad ride a bike. Mom and dad model what to do. As we move to shared, the parents sit him on the bike. but mom and dad have their hands on the handlebars and push. They have more control over the bike. While pushing, mom and dad move with him, instructing him on what he is able to do. Feet on pedals, hands on handlebars, etc. Next, we have guided. The child is on the bike. Mom and dad are simply holding on to the back with one hand. He is riding the bike, but mom and dad are still in the back, coaching to remind him how to steer, balance, etc. Finally, independent. Mom and dad let go of the back of the bike, and he does it all by himself. Now, let's connect lesson anatomy to instruction. The gradual release of responsibility model is the intersection of several learning theories. The slide references the work of many educational leaders and great thinkers in the field of child development. The research is sound, but moving beyond academia, we've all experienced the process, just like the example with learning to ride a bike. Either by yourself or in a group, let's take some time to reflect on how you learn. Let's make the gradual release a bit more personal. Think of something you learned to do in relation to your content area or grade level. Use the space in your viewing guide to record your responses. If you're viewing as a staff or PLC, take some time to share with your colleagues. Please pause the video for a moment and write down your answers to the questions in your viewing guide. Press play when you're ready to resume. Now that we've activated your relevant knowledge, let's move on to Fisher and Frey's work on teacher versus student responsibility. In some classrooms, the teacher moves directly from the modeling to independent student work. In a good enough classroom, we move from a teacher model or direct instruction and then provide time for guided practice. This is where teachers and students work together. Finally, students move to independent practice. Why is this called good enough? Fisher and Frey argue that this model is missing a critical component. So what's missing? Collaboration. This model allows time for students to work together, to collaborate, to actively manipulate the content, to engage in discussion and use their academic vocabulary. This critical step sets students up for success as they move into independent practice. Remember, the teacher is still present, monitoring and adjusting as needed, but we've tipped the scales here and have moved the bulk of the work to the students. How does student active participation, 45% of our time, build a collaborative environment? Another way to think about the gradual release of responsibility is a dance class. First, we have me. This is the teacher modeling component. So, what does releasing responsibility look like in the classroom? One example is modeled reading, where the teacher does all the work. She models good reading while periodically stopping to think aloud for students. Next is we. This is the shared component. The teacher is still modeling, but he is eliciting some participation from students. Linking back to our anatomy of a lesson, this is the teacher input and student active participation. What does this look like in the classroom? Let's think about shared reading. During this type of instruction, the teacher releases some of the responsibility to the children. He reads the text and provides instruction in skills and strategies, but also asks students to try these skills and strategies on the text as a group. Next is 2, and the number 2 is important. We want to stay away from groups or even triads here. We want students to practice with a partner, and the teacher is monitoring and checking for understanding. Linking back to our anatomy of a lesson, this is the heart of student active participation. What does this look like in the classroom? Think about guided reading. During this time, students are now asked to practice strategies and skills learned in a coaching setting. The students do most of the work and the teacher sits back and coaches when necessary. Finally is you. This is independent practice. It is a critical component that needs to be addressed. We need to make sure that students have time to independently practice with the content. What does this look like in the classroom? Independent reading. Now is the time that students show us what they can do and control independently. They read the entire selection on their own and use skills and strategies without assistance from the teacher. So now we're ready to put all of the pieces together. Your viewing guide contains a sample lesson plan. Remember, we're using the lesson plan for its framework versus content. As you go through the lesson, look for the components of the anatomy of a lesson and the gradual release of responsibility. Your viewing guide has a place for you to take notes. If you're watching as a staff or PLC, discuss the evidence you can find of each component. If components are missing or ambiguous, jot down some recommendations for improvement. There are no right or wrong answers. This is time to review the information from today's webinar and think about how it applies to an actual lesson. Feel free to pause the video for as long as you need to engage in the analysis and discussion. Press play when you're ready to move on. Now that you've had some time to consider the anatomy of a lesson in a setting away from your own content or grade level, let's plan for transfer. Think about how you can orchestrate all of the elements from today's webinar into your own practice. Your viewing guide contains a blank planning template for you to use as you begin this work. Feel free to pause the video for as long as you need to engage in your planning and discussion. Press play when you're ready to move on. Either by yourself or in a group, let's transform some ARK verbal cues into SAP verbal cues. Transforming your ARK cues into SAP cues will increase your academic learning time immediately. Content engagement will immediately increase, and your students may even thank you for it. Please pause the video for a moment and write down your answers to the questions in your viewing guide. Press play when you're finished. Either by yourself or in a group, let's revisit the question from the beginning of our webinar. Earlier, I asked you, how can a consistent school-wide instructional model increase academic learning time? I hope you feel better prepared to answer this question. Remember when we asked you about highly effective teaching and what highly effective teachers are doing in their classrooms? Let's bring it all together. Look back to the vocabulary word bank and the critical attributes of academic learning time. Reflect on the anatomy of a lesson and how it relates to the gradual release of responsibility. List at least 10 ways your class will improve as academic learning time increases. Hint: 2 of your answers need to revolve around active manipulation and competency. Please pause the video for a moment and write down your answers to the questions in your viewing guide. Press play when you're finished. That brings us to the end of our webinar. Please take a moment to fill out our brief survey by visiting the link provided. Thank you for learning with us today.